Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something super important, especially if you're a new UPSC aspirant, getting ready for that modern Indian history section.
That's right.
But even if exams aren't on your mind right now, understanding how the British education system took root in India is, well, it's key for anyone who wants to really grasp modern India.
It's a fascinating journey, that's for sure.
Oh, it definitely is, full of twists and turns.
Yeah.
And speaking of journeys, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives.
And don't forget that bell icon, too.
Right. So let's dive in. Picture this. India under British rule. I mean, everything was changing, right? The power dynamics, the culture, and yeah, even how people learned.
It was a period of immense transformation.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to uncover today. How that British education system took hold. Like, what were their motivations, and how does it all continue to shape Indian society even now?
It's really about understanding those long-lasting impacts.
And you know what's interesting? The British, they weren't even sure at first if they should even educate Indians.
There was a lot of debate about it.
Yeah, like, should they teach in English or support traditional learning?
It was a real tug-of-war between different approaches.
Exactly. And then you have these incredible figures who emerge, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. This guy, he challenged the British on their own educational turf. He was a total game changer.
You can't talk about this period without talking about him.
No, you can't.
It's important to remember that this isn't just some isolated story about classrooms. The impact of the British education system is everywhere in India today. Its legal systems, administrative structures, even the seeds of national consciousness, it all started during this time.
Wow.
Understanding this era, it's like unlocking a secret code to modern India.
It's more than just dates and names.
It's about the clash of cultures and ideas that literally shaped an entire nation.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, we have to start with the East India Company, right?
Right.
Because they were hesitant, really hesitant, to fully engage with this whole idea of educating Indians.
I can imagine that.
They were walking a tightrope. They were worried about causing a backlash from the local population if they pushed too hard.
It makes sense. They were trying to establish their control.
Exactly. And even within the company itself, there wasn't a clear consensus on what kind of education to offer. Some argued for promoting Western learning, science, literature, all of that,
Okay.
while others thought they should champion India's own traditional knowledge systems.
So there was this internal struggle within the company about which direction to go in.
Absolutely.
And then you have figures like Warren Hastings, who establishes the Calcutta Madrasa in 1781.
Right.
Just for our listeners who might not be familiar, a madrasa is a traditional Islamic school.
Exactly.
So why would Hastings do that?
It was a strategic move on his part. He was aiming to build relationships, bridges with the local elites by supporting the study of Persian and Arabic, which were, at that time, languages of power and scholarship.
I see.
It was a way for the British to kind of solidify their influence without ruffling too many feathers.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
How so?
Well, on one hand, you have the British East India Company focused on establishing control, but at the same time, they're also fascinated by this ancient Indian knowledge. Like, you have someone like William Jones. This guy was totally engrossed in ancient Indian texts, and he helped found the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784.
Oh, yes, William Jones.
And this society became a hub for translating Sanskrit works.
He was really passionate about that.
Who would have thought? The British so keen to dive into, Indian literature.
And then you have Jonathan Duncan, who founded the Sanskrit College in Benares just a few years later in 1791.
Oh, wow.
His objective was similar, to encourage the study of Hindu laws and philosophy. But, these early initiatives, they were well-intentioned, but they mostly benefited elite Indians. The masses, they didn't really get much out of it.
It was like an exclusive club.
You could say that.
But then enters Rajaram Mohan Roy, a true visionary, I'd say.
Absolutely.
This guy advocated for English education and Western learning. He even challenged the British government's plans to support those Oriental colleges.
He was a bold thinker.
He was. He believed Indians deserved access to modern scientific thought. He wanted them to be able to engage with the world on a global stage.
And his voice had a real impact.
It did. The tide started to turn. English education started gaining traction.
Partly because of practical reasons, too.
Right. The British needed Indians who could speak English to fill those administrative roles.
It was a necessity for them.
It was. but it also created new opportunities for Indians to actually interact within that colonial system. And this is what led to figures like Lord Macaulay, who kind of envisioned an English-educated Indian elite.
Right.
And he believed that this elite would then spread Western knowledge and values throughout Indian society.
That was the idea anyway.
And this is where we get Macaulay's famous filtration theory, right?
Exactly. The idea that educating the upper classes would just naturally lead to knowledge trickling down to everyone else.
But it didn't quite work out that way, did it?
Not really. It was inherently elitist, and it just ended up reinforcing the existing social hierarchies. It didn't really address the educational needs of the majority of Indians.
So you had English education gaining momentum, but within this framework that ultimately reinforced British dominance. It's like almost a contradiction.
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. So you have this shift towards English education happening, and then the need for a more organized system becomes clear.
It did.
And that's where Wood's Dispatch of 1854 comes in.
Often called the Magna Carta of English education in India.
That's a pretty grand title.
It is.
So what did it actually do?
Well, Wood's Dispatch laid the groundwork for a whole system with universities, graded schools, even teacher training colleges.
Wow.
It's really because of this dispatch that we see the establishment of the universities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras in 1857.
So this single document shaped the very structure of Indian education for generations to come.
It really did.
Incredible.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a catch, right? I mean, this system, it might have been organized, but it pretty much mirrored the British model.
It did. And that raises an important question. How appropriate was this model for the needs of India? Was it really designed to empower Indians, or was it more about creating a class that would just serve the British Raj?
It's something to think about, for sure.
It is.
But as the system started taking shape, there were growing concerns about its quality and, how relevant it actually was. Like, you have commissions like the Hunter Commission in 1882, and then later the Hartog Committee in 1929. They highlighted some pretty serious issues.
Oh, yes, those were important critiques.
So what were they pointing out?
Well, they pointed out the neglect of mass education, particularly for girls and in rural areas. There was this huge overemphasis on rote learning, which basically stifled any creativity and critical thinking. And there was a real need for more scientific and technical training if Indians were going to be prepared for a world that was rapidly changing.
So the system was like producing graduates who could memorize facts, but couldn't really apply that knowledge to solve real-world problems.
That's one way to put it.
And let's not forget the chronic lack of funding for education throughout this period. It seems like that was a constant hurdle.
It was a recurring theme, for sure. Adequate financial support was just never really there.
But despite these challenges, you start seeing Indian voices emerging, offering these different visions for what education could be. And one of the most prominent figures in this movement was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi.
Of course.
And his Warta scheme of education, which he introduced in 1937, was a radical departure from that British model.
It was.
He envisioned learning through activity, where education wasn't confined to just the classroom, but was woven into everyday life.
And manual labor and self-sufficiency were at the very core of his approach.
It sounds so progressive, especially for that time.
It really was ahead of its time. Gandhi championed mother tongue instruction, community involvement, hands-on learning. His whole idea was to connect education to the actual needs of Indian society.
Wow. But sadly, the Warta scheme, it faced its own set of obstacles, right?
It did.
Why couldn't it be fully realized?
Well, widespread implementation was really hampered by, all the political turmoil of the time and the outbreak of World War II.
That's such a shame.
It is. But despite its limitations, the Warta scheme remains a pivotal moment in India's educational history.
It challenged the status quo.
It did.
And presented a really powerful alternative to that dominant British model.
Exactly. Welcome back to our deep dive into British education in India. Where we left off, we were talking about the legacy of this period, a legacy that, well, it continues to shape India even today.
It's pretty amazing how decisions made, centuries ago can still have such a big impact on us now.
It's true.
It's like history is a conversation that's still going on,
Exactly. And to really understand India today, you need to understand how British education, with all its complexities, influenced the nation.
For sure. So where do we start with that?
Well, let's start with something that affects the lives of every Indian, even now. the English language,
Right.
it's become this bridge that connects so many different cultures and regions across the country.
It has. I mean, think about it. From Mumbai to Kerala, English is everywhere.
It is. And it all goes back to British rule, when English emerged as the language of administration, higher education, you name it.
It was the language of power, basically.
Exactly. And while their initial goal was to create a class of Indians who could help them run the colonial administration, it ended up having this unintended consequence.
What's that?
It gave Indians a common tongue, this linguistic unity in a land of incredible diversity.
That's fascinating.
It is. Of course, this legacy has its pros and cons.
Yeah, I could see that.
On the one hand, knowing English opened up a world of opportunities for Indians. It connected India to the rest of the globe.
Right.
But on the other hand, it also created a division between those who had access to English education and those who didn't.
So it contributed to social inequality.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
Even after independence, we still see the effects of that.
It's interesting how language can be so tied to power dynamics.
It is.
But let's move on a bit and talk about how British education impacted the political scene in India.
Okay.
Because, I mean, this system, it was designed to strengthen British control, right? But it kind of had the opposite effect.
You could say that.
It sowed the seeds of its own undoing.
How so?
By exposing Indians to Western ideas like democracy, liberty, nationalism, it ignited a spark of political consciousness.
That's right. Think about the leaders of the independence movement. Nehru, Patel, Gandhi.
They were all products of the British education system.
They were. And they used that education to fight for self-rule. They were able to articulate their demands for freedom by drawing on those very principles of liberty and justice that they'd learned.
Wow. It's like the British accidentally gave them the tools to dismantle the Raj.
You could see it that way. And we can't forget about the role of the press and literature in shaping public opinion at the time.
True.
Newspapers and journals became platforms for people to speak out against British rule. Writers and intellectuals, they used their words to expose injustice and rally support for independence.
Words as weapons. Powerful stuff.
They are powerful.
But it wasn't just the political landscape that was affected.
All right.
What about India's institutions? I mean, its legal system, the civil service, the whole administrative structure.
Oh, that was heavily influenced by British education, too. They wanted to create a system of governance that was based on their own model.
So they basically replicated their own system in India.
Exactly. They codified laws, they established bureaucratic structures that mirrored those in Britain, and that had a lasting impact on how India functions even today.
So even though India gained independence, it still operates within a framework that was established during British rule.
To a large extent, yes. Of course, things have evolved and changed over time, but that basic structure, those foundational principles, they can be traced back to the British period.
It's pretty remarkable. So we're seeing a recurring theme here, right?
What's that?
That British education, it had both intended and unintended consequences. It was this complex force that really shaped India in profound ways.
That's a good way to put it.
And speaking of those consequences, how do we see the legacy of British education playing out in India today?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, as we've discussed.
Okay.
The focus on English, it continues to be both a source of opportunity and inequality.
Yeah.
And those bureaucratic structures, while they provide stability, they can also be seen as cumbersome, slow to adapt to the needs of a changing society.
Right, like a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
And what about the education system itself? Like, how has it evolved since India gained independence?
Well, India has made incredible strides in terms of access and literacy rates.
That's good to hear.
It is. But there are still challenges in terms of quality, relevance, and making sure everyone has equal access. There's this ongoing debate about how to strike a balance between the best aspects of the British legacy and the needs of modern India.
It sounds like India is on its own educational journey now, trying to figure out its own path.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important question. How do we reconcile the positive aspects of British education with the more problematic ones?
That's a tough one.
It is. It's about acknowledging the complexities, learning from both the successes and failures, and figuring out a way forward.
So honoring the past without being bound by it.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in.
How so?
Well, we need to encourage students to question, to analyze, to form their own opinions.
To be independent thinkers.
Exactly. It's about giving them the tools to navigate a world where information is everywhere, but knowing how to think critically is essential.
Empowering them to be active citizens who can shape their own future.
Precisely. And that's really what this deep dive is all about. Understanding the past so that we can navigate the present and create a better future.
Welcome back, everyone. We're here for the final part of our deep dive into British education in India. From those early days of colonial rule all the way to independence, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We've looked at how this system evolved, all those complexities, and of course its long-lasting legacy.
And now we're at, the big question. Where do we go from here?
Exactly.
What are the biggest challenges facing Indian education today? And how can we use what we've learned from the past to create a better future?
It's like we're at this crossroads. We've looked back at the path we've traveled, and now we need to choose the best way forward.
A great analogy. So what are those roadblocks we need to be aware of?
Well, one of the most pressing issues is inequality.
We talked about this a bit earlier.
We did, but it's so important it's worth emphasizing.
Absolutely.
Even though there's been a lot of progress in making education more accessible, there are still these gaps based on, socioeconomic background, gender, location. It really affects the whole system.
So the dream of making sure every child gets a quality education, no matter their circumstances, that's still a work in progress.
It is. And this has huge consequences,
Yeah.
not just for individuals, but for the nation as a whole.
It's like we're holding back a huge part of our population from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. And that affects everything. Economic growth, social progress, you name it.
So how do we fix this inequality problem? Is it just about throwing more money at it? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's definitely more complicated. More funding is important, of course. But we also need to address those systemic biases that put certain groups at a disadvantage.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, we need to make sure girls have equal access to education. We need to make sure that rural areas have the infrastructure they need and qualified teachers.
Yeah.
And the curriculum itself, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be relevant for all kinds of learners.
So it's about creating a learning environment where everyone feels supported and valued and empowered to learn.
That's the goal.
And another big challenge we haven't really touched on is quality. Even when students do have access to education, the quality can be really different.
It's true.
And this is where I think the legacy of rote learning, that thing we inherited from the colonial era, still kind of haunts us.
You're right. The system still focuses way too much on memorization instead of critical thinking. And that, it stifles creativity, it limits innovation.
It's like we're teaching students to just repeat information rather than teaching them how to actually solve problems.
That's a great way to put it. And that approach, it's just not going to cut it in the 21st century. We need people who can adapt, who can think for themselves, who can solve problems.
So how do we get past this outdated model? How do we create a learning culture that's really engaging, that empowers students?
It's going to take a pretty big shift in how we approach teaching. We need to move away from that teacher-centric model where the teacher just lectures and embrace more student-centered approaches.
What do you mean by that?
Things like active learning, collaboration, encouraging students to ask questions.
So give them the tools to be independent thinkers.
Exactly. It's about fostering that curiosity, that creativity, that love of learning that goes beyond just textbooks and exams.
I like that. And we can't forget about technology, right?
Of course not.
In this digital age, technology can really help make knowledge accessible to everyone.
Absolutely.
Think about all those online courses, those interactive platforms, even just educational apps. Those can reach students even in the most remote areas.
It's about using technology to bridge those gaps and empower learners.
But technology is just a tool, right?
Right.
It's the human element, the teachers, the mentors, the communities that really makes a difference.
You're absolutely right. That's where the real change happens. We need to invest in our teachers, give them the support and training they need.
Empower them to be innovators and guides.
Exactly. It's about building a supportive ecosystem where teachers feel valued and they have the freedom to do what they do best. Inspire and nurture young minds.
And we can't forget about parents and communities. They play a huge role in fostering that love of learning.
They do. Education isn't just the responsibility of schools, it's a collective effort. Everyone needs to be involved.
So it's about creating a culture where learning is valued, where curiosity is celebrated, where every child feels supported.
That's the dream. A system that's truly inclusive, equitable, and empowers every individual to reach their full potential.
That's a powerful vision. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to our UPSC aspirants listening in.
Of course.
We've covered a lot of ground, the historical context, those key figures, the legacies, and of course the challenges that remain.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But remember, history isn't just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about understanding how we got to where we are today.
And using that knowledge to move forward.
Exactly. It's about connecting those dots, analyzing trends, and forming your own opinions. That's what will set you apart, not just in the exam, but in life.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, folks, we've explored the fascinating and sometimes challenging story of British education in India. From its colonial beginnings to where we are now. We've uncovered its motivations, its achievements, its shortcomings. We've seen its lasting impact on Indian society and those challenges that still remain.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And as you continue to explore this topic on your own, remember to question, to analyze, to think critically. The past holds so many valuable lessons, but the future of education in India, that's in our hands.
It is.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some new insights and a deeper appreciation for the power of education.
And how it can shape individuals, nations, and the world.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future deep dives. And check out our show notes for more resources and reading materials on this topic. Until next time, keep those minds curious and happy learning.
Happy learning.